RFK Jr. censored after having a conversation on Jordan Peterson's podcast about chemicals in the water and the effect that might be having on all sorts of health concerns for young people, and then specifically getting into gender dysphoria, body dysmorphia, and those issues. Let's actually watch a clip from that interview before we talk about it.
These huge levels of depression and despair, loneliness in kids. And I don't think that there's a single cause to it. And I think blaming it on, depression about climate is probably oversimplistic. And in fact, I think a lot of the problems we see in kids, and particularly boys, it's probably underappreciated that how much of that is coming from chemical exposures, including a lot of the sexual dysphoria that we're seeing. They're swimming through a soup of toxic chemicals today, and many of those are endocrine disruptors. There's atrazine throughout our water supply. Atrazine, by the way, if you in a lab put atrazine in a tank full of frogs, it will chemically castrate and forcibly feminize every frog in there, and 10% of the frogs, the male frogs, will turn into fully viable females able to produce viable eggs. If it's doing that to frogs, it could. There's a lot of other evidence that it's doing it to human beings as well.
Yeah. So the problem, I don't want to say the problem, but I think what's causing so much frustration, confusion, conflict on the internet about some of these statements that RFK Jr. is making is that some parts of it are very correct, right? The study that he cites about atrazine in frogs is a National Institute of Health study. It is accurate. The statements that he's making about the level of endocrine disruptors in our environment are 100% true and have been a concern of public health officials for a very long time. Atrazine is one of the most commonly applied herbicides in the world. He is someone who's been very focused on big ag and environmental harms that are the result thereof. He speaks competently with respect to a lot of these things. There was just a story about a number of Phillies baseball players who had a rare kind of cancer that's been linked to the PFAS. It's a kind of endocrine disruptor as well, I believe, that's in AstroTurf materials. And people are now reconsidering whether or not it was smart to put thousands of AstroTurf playgrounds and public spaces all across America over the last few years. There's questions about the endocrine disruptors in Teflon and non-stick surfaces. There's concerns about things like triclosan in toothpaste. These are all things that have been investigated, litigated, the scientific community has raised questions about, and there's ongoing testing about.
Right.
The issue becomes drawing a link that is as yet unproven between the incidence of people who identify as trans or non-binary or what have you, and the prevalence of these kinds of chemicals. And I do wonder if we could have a conversation about what we do know, which is that there are toxic chemicals in our environment, without necessitating the links between those chemicals and autism, or those chemicals in the incidence of people identifying as trans, which, it just has not been scientifically proven,
right.
That link.
And my understanding is that even it's not really controversial to say that chemical is harmful and has been linked to a lot of cancers. Mm-hmm. My understanding was that even the gender effect on the frog's part is right. There was a guy, Tyrone Hayes is the person famous for that study, who has talked about it a lot. It also got a lot of pushback from the EPA and the Scientific Advisory Panel. It is what famously led to that viral Alex Jones video where he yells, "I don't want them putting chemicals in the water that turn the frickin' frogs gay." The whole gay frogs discourse.
That whole thing, right? Naturally. Oh boy.
So, but right, as you said, I don't think it's not. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says a number of careful things there at the beginning. I mean, he's saying that he doesn't think depression about climate change is what he said. It is multifaceted why young people have loneliness and depression. again, the general idea that getting lead out of the pipes and out of the paint was good for
gasoline in the air,
right? Not making people angry and violent is a fairly robust finding at this point. Again, these are things that expert people debate. This has kind of been a theme of our show today, right? There are very smart experts on a lot of sides of a lot of issues that are debating and are hammering, doing studies, and then someone does a study that disproves your study. Maybe your study with methodology wasn't good, and this is just the process. So there's reasonable disagreement on a lot of, again, science is not religion. It's not. Also, there's no chief pope of science who says they're figuring it out.
I think it's perfectly, I don't know that there's very many people who wouldn't welcome any study in the world that people want to do to make sure that there are not links between any number of environmental factors and negative health outcomes. There is an increased incidence of autism, some of which is accounted for by increased awareness, better testing metrics, and those kinds of things. But even the CDC says that's not all of what accounts for it, and there do seem to be heritable factors, environmental factors, unknown factors. And to the extent that people want to continue to investigate that using the scientific process and method, how can that not be a good thing? We're being bombarded, Kennedy is right, by unprecedented numbers of chemicals, many of which go unregulated and untracked. There are all kind of cosmetics that are I would argue underregulated, but there's a wide allowance of what people are allowed to put, what corporations are allowed to put in your lotion, in your deodorant, in your toothpaste. And there are weird guardrails between the kinds of things that have to be more heavily regulated, like food, and those other kinds of cosmetics. So I think I very much welcome the continued scientific investigations into what is actually going on. I think the only problem is when people make claims that are a bit too strong, absent the evidence of confirming something beyond just correlation, because correlation isn't causation.
Yeah, but I think those claims were strong. I think parts of those claims he made are very much up for debate, and the claims were a little strong. But the framing of what he said in that TikTok, so we're viewing this from a deputy tech editor at NBC News, a kind of fact checker, critiquing social media extremism type person, whose takeaway is it's infuriating that this is still up on TikTok. So it was taken off YouTube. He thinks that clip that we just played should be moderated off of, should be censored off of social media because it's disinfo, because it's misinfo. It's wild to think that.
Besides the obvious problem with that, it's also the case that because of Twitter, because of the way that the internet works these days, you just can't censor stuff out of being. I would much prefer health professionals to come in and say, you know what, I appreciate him raising some very legitimate concerns about the number of chemicals in our environment. And if as president, he wants to take on the potential effects of having these endocrine disruptors in our environment, wants to put stronger regulations on companies that are putting these into the world, wants to direct National Institute of Health or CDC or whomever to do more studies about the potential causal relationship between these endocrine disruptors and any number of diseases. Yes, do that. It's hard to disagree with that. But also, I would just give the public some caution about drawing any conclusions before the science has done what it's going to do. That's all. And I think there would be so much more credibility in someone intervening with that kind of a message than we have to take this from the internet because it's too dangerous to talk about the fact that obvious toxins, which have been known and recorded and demonstrated to be toxins for a really long time, are increasingly being found in our food supply and in our cosmetic products, et cetera, and in the grass that we send our children to play on the playgrounds, and all of that. At a certain point, it starts to feel like gaslighting if your criticism is overly broad, in the same way that yes, it can feel like misinformation if your conclusions are too premature.
Sure. And if I was critiquing, I would just say, if I'm not an expert in this category of issues whatsoever, but if I knew something, I don't think this tech editor is either, but if I knew something, I would just say, well, this is the part of it that's wrong, or actually our water has gotten not less contaminated in the same period of time where more young people are identifying as trans, so it would be unlikely there'd be some correlation there. Maybe that's the case, I don't know, but instead it's just, you can't consume this. How dare you consume this? We need to turn this off.
Yeah. I mean, it's also worth noting, I do think that as we heard from that Matt Walsh interview, I think a lot of folks, including Matt Walsh, dramatically overestimate the number of trans Americans that there are. And I think there's some legitimate questions about if the chemical exposure is as common as it is, and it is. Why aren't more people affected? I think Megyn Kelly asked this of RFK Jr. in the conversation she was having with him about autism either earlier this year, maybe last year. And she's like, okay, like I'm open to a lot of what you're saying, but if this really is such a direct causation that, as you're describing it, why doesn't basically everybody have autism? And that's not exactly sciencey either, but I think that those kinds of questions that really force him to substantiate his views can go a lot farther into correcting whatever errors are here than threats of, frankly, censorship.
Well, we'll get more chemicals in those waters, then we'll see how we feel about the frog takeover. That's what I'm wondering.
There's no frog takeover.
Tomorrow on Rising, The Intercept's Murtaza Hussain will join us, and we'll get into his new reporting on the FBI's entrapment of a 16-year-old disabled boy. Very interesting, terrifying, horrifying story. Really glad to be able to bring that to you soon. Plus, Justin Goodman from the White Coat Waste Project will be here to break down their organization's recent COVID origins FOIA request and what that says about where the pandemic started.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who prefer to listen while you're on the move, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
See you later.
Bye-bye.